announce it. Please announce it at the beginning of the panel and a short break, and then
Okay. I'd just like to make a short announcement. At the end of this panel discussion, we'll have a short break and then the performance by Neshama Carlebach. Please be seated. It helps if you don't stand on the side or the middle. It makes security a problem too. Those standing in the front, if you could please be seated. All right, it's my pleasure to introduce my deputy, Managing Editor of the Jerusalem Post, David Brin, and what promises to be a fantastic panel discussion. David, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Congratulations for making it all the way to the last panel. And looking at the lineup of panelists that we have here, I'm confident your dedication will be rewarded.
You're not hooked up.
Ahead of today's conference, I took on two tasks. One, to pronounce the word delegitimization, which I've mastered now. And two, I looked it up in the dictionary to see what it means. Sure. And what it means is to make invalid, illegal, or unacceptable. It's clear that there's been an ongoing effort over the last 64 years to convince the world that Israel is invalid, illegal, and unacceptable. And instead of ebbing, that effort is getting stronger, gaining steam in international bodies like the UN, in op-ed columns in the media, and via organizations like the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaigns. As Ambassador Ron Prosor said this morning, there's a sophisticated campaign underway to demonize and delegitimize Israel, like Chinese water torture, one drop at a time, I believe you said, right? Israel's government and its supporters, like those seated here today, are fighting those delegitimization efforts in an ongoing manner. At the same time that they're waging this battle, there's a thin line to walk in which we have to be careful to differentiate between those who would like to see Israel eliminated and those with legitimate, honest criticism of the country's policy. The whole issue of fighting this battle raises many questions which I don't have to answer, because luckily we have an expert panel here with us today who are dealing with the issues like this on a daily basis. Let me quickly introduce them. Only two of them spoke before. Professor Alan Dershowitz is he's a Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. He's the author of dozens of books and one of the world's top Israel advocates. And Ambassador Ron Prosor is Israeli ambassador to the UN and on the front lines leading Israel's battles at the UN. He's served in the Foreign Ministry for over 20 years, most recently as Israel's ambassador to the UK. Malcolm Honlein. He's the Executive Vice Chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. He regularly meets with world leaders in Jewish communities around the globe and has written and lectured on international relations in Israel and Middle East affairs. Daniel Seaman, over in the corner, is the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Public Diplomacy, the ministry in charge of putting Israel's best face forward to the world. For 10 years, Danny served as the Director of the Israel Government Press Office, where he had very intimate contact with the hundreds of foreign correspondents sent to the region to cover Israel. Alon Pinkas. He's the former Consul General of Israel in New York and a foreign relations expert. He served as an advisor to Ehud Barak and Shimon Peres, and a little known fact, he was once the military correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. Did you see your name in the movie at the beginning? You gave the byline when Israel and Jordan established ties. David Suissa is president of Tribe Media Corporation, which publishes the Jewish Journal, Tribe Magazine, and the popular news site JewishJournal.com. His expertise spans the fields of marketing, advertising, journalism, Israel advocacy, and new media. And last but not least, Nomi Reagan. Nomi's a world-famous novelist, playwright, and journalist living in Jerusalem since 1971. A staunch advocate for women's rights, Nomi writes regularly in the Jerusalem Post about Israel and Jewish issues. I'd like to ask Ambassador Prosor the first question. You're fighting the battle against the delegitimization of Israel every day at the UN. you touched on it this morning, but do you see a more concerted effort recently, a coalition of anti-Israel bodies that are more organized than in the past?
Yes, but I think I'd want to start by saying how sophisticated, on the one hand, the whole thing is, and how it's important to deal with it. We can start with something that, you know, is on the verge of ridicule. You remember this part where the Egyptians in Sharm el-Sheikh came out with a story that the shark attacks in Sharm el-Sheikh against tourists who were basically done, the shark was a Mossad agent. So that's a nice story. But then the BBC, and I quote, ran on the BBC site, Israeli ambassador denies shark being a Mossad agent, quote unquote. Before you say Jack Robinson, we had a vulture from the Tel Aviv University on a migration flight to Saudi Arabia, was caught and again branded as a Mossad agent. I had real fear that the bird sang in the interrogation, but the whole issue here is that on the verge of critics moves from that and serious response by the media to something that would shock you all. That in the year 2008, no, it was 2010, in the cradle of democracy at Westminster, a baroness by the name of Jenny Tang stands and says, Israeli rescue teams to Haiti flew over to Haiti in order to harvest the organs of the Haitians. This is Britain. You would think, of course, that Prime Minister Gordon Brown or David Cameron would go after her. The only one going after is yours truly. And you see on BBC, on the alternative Christmas address to the British public, instead of the Queen, Ahmadinejad, a guidance to human rights, has 7 unchallenged minutes on BBC, basically giving everything that he gives. And this is something that begins with that. And the bottom line of one, I can give you many other examples, but the bottom line is that our adversaries are crossing the red lines every day. We and this wasn't exactly right like that, and it was only 50% of the story. And what we have to do is, because this is a concerted effort, it's not a conspiracy, but people are beginning to do things that they have not dared do in the past. And we have a tendency, and rightly so, to look at things and say, hey, is that legitimate criticism of a democratic government? Which some of the time it's legitimate criticism, but under that banner, a lot of things are being brought which are really, really problematic, that have nothing with serious criticism, and it's building on. And part of the story is for us to be able to stand up and do something about it. And I want to tell you that at least in the United Nations, I changed the code of conduct. Most of the time we were sitting in the different committees, and there are many, the United Nations. Most of the team was sitting and listening in what I would call a listening mode, listening silence mode, writing telegrams back to Jerusalem without responding. So that changed because I said, you don't have a choice to do that. You have to respond on everything that is said against Israel. And if for some odd reason you have a logical explanation of why not to respond, you need my personal permission. So the whole code of conduct is much more, I would say, on offense than on defense on issues that I think we have a lot to say. And I can tell you, and I really, and I can give you many examples on things that go on. But the bottom line of this is that our adversaries are crossing the red lines. I'm not saying it's a concerted effort, you know, they coordinate with each other. But we have to be able, all around this room, to put our differences aside. which we haven't been able to do as well, even in the podiums in today's amazing debates because of our culture, and to put that aside because the danger to the well-being of the state of Israel from people who don't necessarily see the well-being of the state of Israel as the first priority is much, much more dangerous today than it has been in many years before. And if there's one thing that I would ask you all, and that is try to unite under something that we have full consensus on, and that is who we are, what we are, and the values that we stand for. Thank you.
Thank you. Nomi Reagan, you've been a defender of Israel for a very long time. I wanted to ask you about the changing battlefield online on the internet, both the ability to disseminate lies about Israel and also the ability to defend Israel. I know you've been very involved in that.
Well, I'd like to first preface my remarks by saying how I got involved in this whole internet battle to combat what was going on around me in the media. This was in 2001, minding my own business, sitting in my house watching CNN, because you couldn't get Fox News in Israel. There was no Fox News in Israel in 2001, so all you got was information from CNN. And it was February, and I wrote this down because I wanted to be exact, because I remember these details. This was February 11th in 2001. A truck carrying Israeli soldiers narrowly missed being blown to bits by a bomb detonated on the side of the road near Gush Katif in Kfar Darom of the Gaza Strip. 2 days before that, on a Friday night, on the eve of Shabbat, the Palestinians shot artillery shells on a Jewish settlement in Netzarim, and the family spent the Shabbat in bomb shelters. The Palestinians also opened fire on military roadblocks near Gush Katif, and all in all, there were about 20 incidents of Palestinian gunfire and 3 grenade attacks on the Gaza Strip on the weekend of February 9th through 11th. But those watching CNN didn't see any of those things. Instead, what CNN chose to show us on Sunday, February 11th, was the Abdin family of Gaza in their tent, tearfully cursing out Israeli soldiers for leveling their house and land. No, Mrs. Abdin said predictably, our house and land were not used for shelters for gunmen shooting at Israeli cars on the road to Gush Katif. Inexplicably then, CNN cut to a nearby elaborate villa in the building stages, which was untouched, and its owner, an elderly Mrs. Khaltima, who shouts in Arabic, were dutifully translated by a CNN reporter, and she said, God damn the Jews and Americans, God take revenge on them. My son and 6 or 7 others will strap explosives to themselves and blow themselves up in Israel.
Excuse me, Nomi, I'm going to have to interrupt you because we only have 3 or 4 minutes, so maybe.
I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to continue in this vein.
Okay.
Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because as a writer, what I understood from this is that there is a narrative. The press it seems to be telling you that they are objectively reporting the facts, but what CNN was doing on that weekend was ignoring what was going on completely and staging a narrative in order to shape the news. There is a word for this. This is called propaganda. What I tried to look into afterwards was why CNN, which was a news source that I had always listened to and I had no objection to, and I always considered an objective news source, what had happened to turn them into this very manipulated and very biased view. And I found out 3 things, and I think they hold true today, and it's something we should really think about when it comes to the media. What are their motivations? Number 1, at that time, CNN was trying to launch CNN Arabic. Their ratings were down, and they needed this influx of new viewers, and they were trying to be very pro-Arab and trying to launch CNN Arabic with news that would appeal to Arabs all over the Middle East. So here you have this, all of a sudden, this anti-Israel report. Number 2, there was a new bureau chief, Mike Hanna. Mike Hanna had just transferred to Israel from South Africa, where he was an award-winning reporter, which he came bringing with him the narrative of the, the poor oppressed blacks of South Africa and, the heroic work of Nelson Mandela, and he tried to transfer Nelson Mandela to Yasser Arafat.
Number 3.
So in a situation like this, you're an ordinary person, you see what's going on, you live in Israel, you see what's happening, what can you do? And the wonders of the internet is that you can actually contact somebody from CNN. I contacted Easton Jordan, and I said to Easton Jordan, who was the head of news of CNN at that time, I said, what is going on? What are you doing? And we began a certain dialogue, which of course led nowhere, because in 2003, Easton Jordan admitted, at least in Iraq, that he had been tailoring the news not to get his reporters killed in Iraq by saying anything negative about Saddam Hussein. So that showed you where CNN was coming from. And Mike Hanna is now reporting for Al Jazeera. So,
Okay, thank you. Would like to, Professor Dershowitz like to respond?
Well, I want to respond to that because I think it's very important to distinguish between what we've heard now, which is, reporting, which might be somewhat biased. I hear complaints all the time about CNN. I hear complaints all the time about the New York Times. That's not our problem, folks. That is not our problem. The media constantly misreports and overstates. They're selling soap. They're trying to get on Arabic television. Big deal. We can handle that. We can deal with that. The problem is a much deeper and much more serious one. It's the one that the ambassador talked about. It's the legitimation of the most extreme kind of anti-Israel, bordering on anti-Semitic, and mostly it comes from Jews and from Israelis who use their Jewish, quote, heritage. These are people who have never identified as Jews except to attack Israel. Take a guy like Gilad Atzmon, who was off the charts. Nobody would even know who he was. He's a guy who apologizes to the Nazis for comparing them to Israel because Israel's far worse. Now, how can any rational person believe that? He says in his book that Jews probably did kill Christian children and use their blood in matzahs. Nobody could believe that. That's not the problem. The problem is that the Friends Seminary in New York invites Gilad Atzmon to talk to their students. The problem is that Professors Walt and Mearsheimer endorse Atzmon's book. The problem is that Richard Falk, the former UN rapporteur on Palestine, says Atzmon's book is a book that should be read and widely discussed by everybody. Now, I'm not young. I've lived through a lot of horrors in the world. Let me tell you that in the worst days of South African real apartheid, there was never this kind of attack on South Africa as we're seeing on Israel. It wasn't even close. In Stalin's worst days, we never saw that kind of attack. In the 1930s, I'm not old enough to remember this, but I've read about it. In the 1930s, with the buildup of fascism in both Italy and Germany, we never saw this kind of irrational attack. My friend Phyllis Chesler has a wonderful phrase for it. She calls it almost eroticized hatred. And I have to tell you, I've stood face to face with some of these folks. They believe it. They really think we're worse than the Nazis. They really think we are the worst people on the face of the earth. They really think that Israel supporters, I had people chanting at a speech recently, Dershowitz, Goebbels, just the same, the only difference is the name. That kind of thing that you hear, but it's the movement from extremism, off the charts, things that would be ignored, to becoming accepted by the mainstream. It is absolutely crucial that we must distinguish between our friends who we disagree with and our real enemies. We should not be focusing on CNN. We should not even be focusing on Peter Beinart. We should not be focusing on friends who make mistakes. We should be focusing on people who genuinely believe that the falsification of history is proper, that calling the best the worst is proper, that focusing on Israel's flaws, and there are flaws, every country has flaws, but exaggerating to the point of making them Nazi-like, that is beginning to filter down into young students on the campus. And that's where we really have to draw the battle lines. We have to know the difference between our friends who we disagree with, people who might be somewhat biased, and those who genuinely seek to use the media to destroy Israel. It's only the latter that pose a national security threat to Israel, so we must get our priorities straight.
Thank you, Professor Dershowitz.
I know that you're going to go on, and that's okay, and I want you to go on. I just want to say one thing. The problem is not CNN. The problem is that the Israeli government, in order to appease CNN, is willing to do anything. And sometimes they take down roadblocks they shouldn't take down to make us look better in the press, and sometimes they fire very important people in the army, as they just did with Mr. Eisner, in order to make us look better in the press, and that's the problem. That's the problem with CNN. It's that our government is trying to appease them by doing things that are harmful to its citizens. That's the problem.
Okay, thank you. Malcolm Honline, do you think that you travel around the country a lot, do you think the average American buys into the claims made by those that would delegitimize Israel? Or do they realize it's just largely unsubstantiated propaganda?
Well, as much as I had hoped to give a yes or no answer, it's not really possible. 5 years ago, I spoke at the Herzliya conference, and I spoke about the poisoning of the elites and the danger of delegitimization. And for many in the audience, Israelis and foreigners, it was as if I was talking about Mars. That is not the case today. I think that there's a growing recognition that there is, and I believe, unlike the UN, it is a coordinated effort. I do believe that we can see the patterns that were true in Europe being true here in the United States. If you go back to the report of the House of Commons in December, I think 2007, done by 3 non-Jewish members, that is the blueprint for the United States, where they talked about the poisoning atmosphere on campuses. They talked about the predecessors to Walter Mearsheimer and to this global campaign. I think that Naomi's right, and I think Professor Dershowitz, I don't think it's a distinction. I think both are problems that we have to confront. The first thing is coming to an understanding. Delegitimization is not only impossible to pronounce, nobody knows what it means. So we have to begin to come to understand that this is not about 67. It's not about settlements, and all the time wasted this morning talking about settlements. That's not the issue in people's minds. Americans don't really care. We demonized the settlers. It became an issue, a roadblock in political sense. But the fact is, this is about 47. This is about Israel's right to exist. They want to delegitimize Israel in the same way, and I was at the March of the Living last week in Warsaw, and it came to me that this is the form that the Nazis used to dehumanize Jews. This is to delegitimize Jews, but you go after the corporate Jew, the collective Jew, the state of Israel, because you can't say 70 years after the Shoah, at least not in all places, that I hate Jews, but you can't say I hate Israel. And what we have to look at is history teaches us that it's not what our enemies do, it's what we fail to do. It's that we raise the bar on what we will tolerate. That Pat Buchanan can speak on national television about Jews being a fifth column, and we don't tear down the stations. It's our fault, not his. If Walter Mearsheimer can get away on campus after campus and have their book used, 1 million copies sold from Harvard to University of California, it's our fault. All the alumni, all the faculty, everybody should be being mobilized about this. For too long, we were really tolerating. We keep raising the bar and raising the bar until all of a sudden we say, where did this come from? The answer is, it's we who helped create it. Martin Luther King said, we won't be judged by the attacks of our enemy, but by the silence of our friends. And we too often accept that people can get away with it, that people can talk about us in these terms. Understand, when they talk about Israel, they mean us. They mean the Jewish people. But the way you hurt the Jewish people is to say that Israel doesn't have the right to defend its citizens like every other country. Israel doesn't have a right to be a member in the UN when islands with 60,000 members, their membership isn't challenged in the UN. And we have taken steps. I just take 1 minute to say that we've created the Strategic Communications Center where we are trying to get into the 21st century. The Jewish community, despite the fact that we control all the media, as they say, we are in the 18th century when it comes to using the electronic media. We have to be there where the young people are. The truth is that the vast majority of the American people support Israel in record numbers. But as broad as it is, that's how thin it is. And we dare not take it for granted. Not our friends in the evangelical communities, not our friends in any other community, and especially our youth. We've taken them for granted too long. It's not just in high school. In elementary school, we've got to start teaching them. That's why the Catholic Church says, give me a kid till he's 6, you can have him the rest of their lives. So we've created the Leadership Action Network. In 6 months, 4 million people, half of them non-Jews, have signed up to speak out and to act on Israel. We created the Lawfare Project to mobilize lawyers around the country, and Alan has been helpful on it, to be able to fight these attempts. They're permeating every sector of society, unions, churches, legal groups, entertainment, and the boycott efforts. And we have to be there on every one of those fronts. We can't excuse any of them, and hold people to account and expose them when they won't stand with us and they won't tell the truth for us, and they keep demonizing Israel and the Jewish people. We can counter it. And we also did one more thing, and that's called America's Voices in Israel, where we are taking now movie stars, Hispanic leaders, black leaders, the top movie stars. And everybody said you'll never penetrate Hollywood. We have this week 11 top stars going to Israel, blacks, Hispanics, and whites. Everybody lining up more and more now want to go because they see the truth. And there's nothing that sells Israel better than Israel itself. So the answer to this challenge, which is so vital, and unfortunately today we saw how mischievous things is when a guy makes a reference to Germany on this platform, and then it can be manipulated. Everybody says, listen, what are you talking about? Here's a government official drawing the analogy. So Israelis have to be much careful. Alan is right. We have to be able to go after Israelis and not say you have a license to come here and say whatever you want just because you have the title Israeli. You have to be held to account just as every other person who speaks against the Jewish people or against the Jewish state. No more tolerating it. Zero tolerance.
Thank you, Malcolm.